This is Mrs. Garple, and in this video we're going to review what it means for domain and range. Keep in mind that domain is the set of x values used in the function. The range is the set of y values used in the function. This particular graph is considered continuous because it's a curve that I can continue to trace with my finger, my pencil, my stylus. It's not like I'm having to jump from point to point. It's one continuous curve. This particular curve is called a parabola, and this parabola has a maximum value at y equals 5. It appears that it's going to continue moving downward. I don't have any points marked at my ends here that indicate that it would stop, so we're going to assume that it continues. As I look at this graph, it appears that from its maximum point, it is getting wider as it goes down further. So the further down it goes, the wider it gets. And since we don't know that it's going to stop, we're going to assume that it doesn't stop and that it involves all real numbers, which in interval notation, I can write the interval from negative infinity to infinity is my domain. So this is an interval. This is not an ordered pair. It's the spread of x values used in our function. The range, I've already pointed out, this particular graph has a maximum point, so it doesn't go any higher, but it does continue to move downward. Even though we're looking at this from a maximum continuing downward, when I write my range, I start with the smallest value, which is negative infinity. And notice, each time I have an infinity symbol, I have parentheses. That's because infinity doesn't, there is no one number that is infinity. The real number system continues infinitely in the positive and negative directions. So we use a parenthesis because there's no place that it's going to stop. The maximum, however, does stop at a y value of 5, and it includes the y value of 5. So I'm going to use a square bracket. Our next graph is a line. Again, I don't see any distinct points at the end that indicate it's going to stop, so I'm going to assume it continues. My domain, the set of x values, it continues in both the positive and negative direction of my x-axis. So this domain is also negative infinity to infinity. My range, I don't have a maximum or a minimum because it continues in an upward direction if I read it to the right, it continues in a downward direction if I read it to the left. So my range is going to be the same as my domain in this case, negative infinity to infinity. My next graph is another parabola, but this parabola has a minimum value, not a maximum value. My graph is continuing upward, and as it goes up, it's going to get wider. So the domain, again, is going to be negative infinity to infinity, and my range, because I have a minimum at the value of 4, I'm going to start my range interval with the 4, and again use that square bracket because we're including the number 4, and it's continuing on into infinity. Our last example is what we consider to be a discrete function or a discrete graph. And that's because it just has specific points. When we identify the domain and range in this case, we need to make sure that we're identifying that it's going to be specific points. For my domain, I'm looking at what's the spread of values for my points. It's including -1 and going up to +3. I'm going to make the statement that it's integers because we're not including any values in between these steps. So it's integers, and I'm going to have -1 to a +3, but I'm not going to write it using interval notation. I'm going to write it as a compound inequality. So x is greater than or equal to -1, x is less than or equal to 3. So our domain is integers from that are less than or x is greater than or equal to -1 and x is less than or equal to 3. And I say equal to on those because we are including the values -1 and 3. Now we're going to do something similar with the range. I'm going to identify my lowest value and my highest value. Again, these are going to be integers. And the lowest value is -5. The largest value is 7, but range, is the y value. So I'm going to write a very similar inequality for my range, but instead of using x, I'm going to use y. So y is greater than or equal to -5, and y is less than or equal to 7. And by stating that it's integers, I know it's going to be the integers from -5 to 7 in this case. And this concludes our review of domain and range.